Pastor Trey, thank you so much for being with us today.
No, I appreciate you having me. I recognize this as a sacred space that you have cultivated, and I do not take it lightly or for granted that you would invite me into this place. So thank you.
Oh, that's really sweet of you to say. We do try to think of this as a sacred space. So that's a
And you should.
beautiful, beautiful way to say that. Um, Before we get into this book that Stacy and I are both fangirling over, I just pre-ordered it. You sent us a PDF copy to read, and I am so crazy about it. I said I have to have a hard copy. So, and I know Stacy has too. Before we get into the book, I just would love to just ask you for a minute, just a little bit about your background and how you became a pastor.
Oh man, let me see the shortest version of the story that I can give. Still gonna be longer than it needs to be, but I'm gonna try to.
Just give
So
it to us. Give it to us.
yeah, like a whole lot of people, I grew up in and around church, right? If anybody who's listened to me on any podcast has probably heard the story a million times by now, but my mother loves to tell the story of how I was born on a Wednesday and she brought me to church that Sunday. Right. And it's a true to life story. 4 days old, I was in the church, and around probably the age of maybe 7 or 8, I said I wanted to be a preacher. I wanted to be a pastor. And I told my pastor at the time, and he said, cool, your first step, read the Bible. And I was like, yes, absolutely. I want to be a fireman. A fireman is what I wanted to be this whole time. Right. I was like, I'm not doing that. It's way too many words and all that stuff. And so I still went to church and everything, but it was because it's what you do, right? It's my
Hmm.
mother. It's all I've known. It's what my mother brought me literally since I was born.
Hmm.
And around the time I was probably 15 or 16, I remember my mother, I remember waking up on a Sunday. My mom asked me, she said, are you going to church this morning? It was a question she had never asked before. I thought it was a trick question. I said, no. She said, okay. And she left. And from that point on, my relationship with church kind of shifted. I felt like I had a little more autonomy. And so I didn't do the things just because they were what you did. I still identified as a Christian and everything, but I wasn't very active in the church, or I wasn't thinking about my faith very seriously. And kind of how I went through college. I went to a very secular university setting, where I met a woman uh, who asked me if I would consider going to church with her. She didn't grow up in church like I did. She was foreign. She just had a curiosity about it. And because I liked women, I went to church with her. And she eventually became my wife. And we started going to church regularly again. I started asking questions about my faith. And a lot of these questions were some obvious questions like, wait, does this make sense? And some of it was also because the environment I went to in college and the things I was being challenged with, the different worldviews. So I brought all of that back to church with me. And in that, I really grew a hunger for wrestling with questions of faith and matters of faith. And discerned over time through serving in various capacities, dealing with young people and everything, that I kind of have a gift for holding to the faith while making room for all of the questions and the tensions and everything. And that kind of leads me to where I am, not only as a pastor in a local church congregation. I'm not the lead pastor. I believe in serving the community and everything. So I actually function as the executive pastor here, but also as a public theologian who does a lot of work for people who aren't in my local congregation, might not be in any church at all, may never darken the doorways of a church again. But what is the story of Jesus? What does this have to say to you in your situation? Did I answer the question? I was long.
Perfect. That's perfect. I love that.
All right.
I love that. Um, and I just want to start out by talking about the title of your book, Theologizin Bigger. Um, I'm going to ask you in a minute to explain what theologizing is,
Yeah.
but I just want to say immediately the word bigger jumped out at me because um, from my religious background, and I've been Southern Baptist, I've been Church of Christ, I've been non-denominational, I have been through several different Free Will Baptists. I've checked them all out, and I have found that a lot of times in those religious constructs they make God really small. And so the word bigger really, I mean, both of the words jumped out at me, but I just wanted to say I appreciated that. And will you explain what theologizing is?
Most definitely. I I talk about it a little bit in the book, but my mind is always racing around everything I'm interacting with, a lot of times I default to sermonizing, right? Like at the end of the day, I'm a preacher, one of them preachers who can't help but think of things. Like I'll really be shouting to myself in the shower sometimes off of things I see. And so a lot of times I'm seeing things that seem random to people and making connections about God, the story of God and the gospel all the time. And it's funny, my wife makes fun of me. She's like, yo, why are you always doing that? Like, yo, I really can't help it. And I realized that it's part of what I do. I'm theologizing. I'm searching for God in the crevices of everything, right? And I realized that there are lots of people who do that, maybe not to that extent, but we're always making these connections. It's part of why a lot of people feel dissonance in their faith, because they're making these connections that don't always line up with what they're receiving on Sunday mornings or during midweek services, right?
Yeah.
And while I do have like theological education and everything, and you could rightfully call me a theologian, that sounds like a bit of a job description as opposed to who you are essentially, right? I'm a theologizer. Theologizing is what I do. And so theologizing for me is a way of naming that pursuit of the story of God in your reality, in your everyday life, you know, even if it's not what you would readily identify as a sacred moment or a sacramental activity. Where are we finding God in that?
Love that.
It's beautiful. And we've captured some quotes from your book and have some questions that kind of center around those quotes. But before I ask you the first set here, I just want to say how lovely it is to meet you in person and how honored I've been just to follow you on Twitter for the past few years, because you've definitely expanded how I theologize. And your presence on that platform, which can be just a total dumpster fire.
You think?
It's great because it's at the same time very hopeful for me, and also you just let it rip when people, you know, just show up as a very low version of what their potential is. So thank you
I'm
for
glad
both
you
of
were
it.
upfront about that, because sometimes people set me up to be this guy who's always like a deep thinker and all this thing. And yeah, that part is there, but also I'm just a dude. So thank you for presenting me in the like you know the Michelle Obama line, like when they go low, we go high.
Yeah.
Yes,
No,
exactly.
my line is always, when you go low, I'll remind you that I started from the bottom and I feel comfortable there. I feel at home.
And I'm comfortable there too.
Yeah, you know, this is one of those things, because I don't take anything too seriously. I'll never take any of it personally, and I'm like, okay, if you want jokes, we can do this, and I'm better than you at that. Like that's probably let's keep this respectful. Otherwise, you know, like we can make a show. You know,
Yeah, we can do this.
Yeah.
Throw down. All right. So here's the first quote. I captured so many. Like I took notes, and my notes are just like a mile long.
Oh wow.
So here's the first one. Theologizing ain't just for theologians. It's for everybody who's still thinking thoughts about God. Good thoughts, bad thoughts, skeptical thoughts, undoubting thoughts, old thoughts, new thoughts. And when you're willing to sit with those thoughts and follow where they lead you, I'd call you a theologizer. So really nice, because it captures, you know, that picture of what it means to be a God follower. That's not kind of the Instagram worthy, you know, coffee and picking out this great verse and everything's wonderful. Like it exists in the crevices, like you said, of everything. So like Marcia mentioned, we come from a really evangelical background, lots of different churches that we've flown, you know, in and out of. But if you've kind of grown up in that kind of Instagram worthy Christianity, and theologizers are those older white men with big thick books on the mantle, right? Or they're just historical men predominantly who, you know, are no longer with us. But how do you start here if that's how you grew up and what you know, and you know, how do you start having your own theology? What do you suggest?
Well, I suggest, I think the easiest entryway, because a lot of time that theology that is handed down by those the men you were just speaking of is emphasizes the Bible, the centrality of the Bible, right? And so let's start there. Do we take the words of Paul seriously when he says that it is for freedom that you have been set free? And in the very context of that, he was talking about the fact that there are people coming into this new community set free by Jesus who are insisting that they need to follow the ways of another people, of people they do not necessarily belong to, right? Like there are Jewish people. He's not encouraging them to stop being Jewish, but he's saying that if you are a Gentile convert, if this is how you met Jesus, why would you then force yourself to become a situation where Jesus didn't save you in that state? Jesus doesn't need you to become that way, right? So do we take those words seriously where Paul says that it is for freedom that you have been set free? Do we take the words of Jesus seriously when he says that greater works than these shall you do? Do we take the actual words of the Bible seriously when they say that this is not the ending point, that we can't be caged in? This is about, as in Revelation, behold, I am making all things new. Are you willing to take part in that? Are you willing to join in that, right? And so I think there's a degree to which sometimes we act as though, like, the electric fences for dogs, where there's a little collar and little fence posts, like we're caged in, except there's not any real like power holding us in. We've just seen the flags and we're scared to approach the flags because we know what the collar is supposed to mean, right?
That's a good visual.
Ooh, that is.
Yeah.
So I spend a lot of time in private coaching with women who want to see God in new ways because they can no longer interact in the ways they used to because of spiritual abuse. That's a lot of what I do. Right. And one of their biggest holdups here is that they're scared. If I do this, if I color outside of the lines, if I, go this my own way and try to see my own story differently, then if I get it wrong, what's going to happen? I'm so scared of getting it wrong. So how would you encourage them?
Yeah, that's perfectly natural, to be afraid of falling and failing. And again, if we take the words of the Bible seriously, right, we have the episode where Jesus is walking on water toward his disciples in the middle of a storm. And then Peter, seeing what's happening, and when Jesus identifies himself like, hey, y'all chill out, it's me. And Peter says, hey, if it's really you, tell me to come out there to you. Whatever you say has to happen, right? He says, all right, then come. And then Peter goes and he walks on the water too. And then Peter is reminded of the storm that surrounds him, and that shakes him a little bit. And Peter begins sinking. But right before like anything gets really bad for Peter, Jesus grabs him. It's like, hey, like, what's going on? Why did your faith fail you? And I say all of that to say that your fear is natural. I don't want it to stop you from taking the steps or going in the direction that you feel that God has called you to. And that even if and when you begin to sink, that there is grace for that. And if we take the words of Jesus seriously, when he says that nobody can take them from my hand, like the Father's given them to me, and I'm not letting anybody go, I haven't lost any of these, right? Then there is grace for that. And it's fine to name that fear. It is fine to name those nerves, to acknowledge the reality of what that is. But part of what faith is believing that even if and when we fall, that Jesus is there to grab us by the hand and pick us up. Remind us that, maybe our faith isn't perfected yet, but interestingly enough, it's never our full and perfect faith that is required. It's just believing that the faithfulness of Jesus is enough to deliver us.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
That's great. Love it.
Yeah, that is a big thing for a lot of friends of mine too. They're just, they're afraid to cross that electric fence. They're afraid they're going to get shocked. I love that visual. Okay. I'm going to go to another quote here from your book.
All right, let's do it.
Okay. Number 2. The quote is, the marginalized people of this world are the most capable of imagining a more inclusive world. The disabled community is best equipped to lead us to a more accessible world. Women are best equipped to lead us away from misogyny. The racialized among us are best equipped to author a world without white supremacy. Indigenous peoples can best help us reverse colonization. Queer people can best help us combat a number of phobias. Faith in what we have not seen, yet still believe in, is what drives us to envision better ways of showing up and take stride towards it. Love, love, love that. So, Trey, what are we missing out on in this country where there's such an exclusive Christian community, and we want to put up this wall between our churches and our church people and the marginalized out there?
That's a great question. I think there are two major things that we're missing out on. The first of which is an opportunity for self-reflection and self-examination. Right. And I say that because when I do theology, and I speak about it in the book a little bit, I say things and people will say, oh, that's liberation theology, right? Or that's Black liberation theology. They attack an adjective on the front of it to let me know, remind me that what I'm doing is somehow different than what they are doing, which is fine. I don't run from those labels. But if you think about it, we have women doing feminist theology. We have Black people doing Black liberation theology. We have liberation theology from the global South. There's Palestinian liberation theology. There are Black women doing womanist theology. And everybody else gets an adjective put on it. And somehow we have deluded ourselves into thinking that the reformers who are doing Reformation theology are somehow doing regular theology with no adjective. We just accept that as the default. And when we miss out on that adjective, we lose out on opportunities to ask what is actually impacting this, right? So I own my own biases as I approach whatever theological table I'm sitting at. And when you don't have that adjective in front of it, you just assume that this is all that there is. So in this exclusive Christian community, we actually set up ignorance as a default. And I don't mean ignorance in an insulting way. I mean literally being unaware of that which surrounds you.
Yes.
Right? Like you miss out on the fact that there are people around the planet right now in very orthodox forms of Christianity who do not approach this faith the same way that you do. And some of their faith traditions are more ancient than yours, are more readily traced to the apostles who walked with Jesus than the faith that you practice, right? And so within these exclusive Christian communities, we are missing out on an opportunity to reflect on the faith that we carry. And it's not to call the faith that you carry deficient in any way, but it's not fully informed. Right? We're missing out on community, on the unity of the body of Christ in that way. And in a similar vein, the other thing that I think we're missing out on is the work of the Spirit of God. Because if we take the story of Pentecost seriously in Acts chapter 2, the miracle that happens there is that the disciples communicate the truth of God in new languages. Now, if you are familiar with how languages work, you know there's not always a one-to-one equivalent. We don't always have one phrase or an idiom that we can translate perfectly into another language. Sometimes we have taken an idea and present it in a way that will make sense in that language based upon how their culture is oriented. What that means then is that the disciples were communicating the truth of God in ways that they could not comprehend themselves. The miracle of Pentecost and the Holy Spirit is that the truth of God transcends your own understanding, your own cultural orientation. And so in these exclusive communities, we miss out on the work of the Spirit of God. That means that people are receiving the truth of God in ways that do not, cannot, and will not even make sense to you. And that's okay because the Spirit is powerful enough to keep it true.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Spirit is powerful enough to keep it true. That is.
And that's why, you know, God didn't stop moving during the pandemic, right? Even when all the church doors were closed, there was still this huge movement of the Spirit. I also think about, as you're talking about how this intersects with emotional intelligence development.
Yes.
Because without self-awareness, you cannot be other aware. So, you know, the foundation is self-awareness. And if we're not cultivating that in ourselves, then we have no hope of building relationships.
Right. It's an inherently dehumanizing reality to inhabit. And a lot of times we don't realize it. But we're losing part of the imago Dei within ourselves. We're losing part of what God instilled, the part of God that was instilled in us to identify us with God is being lost when we cut off these ways of communing with the other.
Yeah, exactly. So question number 3, this is going to be a crazy year. As if other years before it were not crazy, but this one I know is going to bring its own challenges. And I already see in various places where I show up, I already see concern about, you know, what things are happening in families around just in the election cycle. So we have a lot going on. I saw this one liner from you, this quote, the American dream, the way of Jesus, integrity, pick 2. And followed up by the choice of the church between empire and kingdom will direct the imagination of the church. Will we be bound by the concept of scarcity, or will we enter a reign in which 5 barley loaves and 2 fish are more than enough to feed a multitude for an afternoon? These are 2 vastly different ways of viewing the world. One of these ways accords with almost everything we've known and seen. Scarcity makes sense. It validates the principles of law and order that make us feel safe and civilized. But scarcity always creates losers, and Jesus stands with them on purpose. So as we think about this kind of culture of scarcity going on, and the outsiders and the insiders and the rights and the wrongs and rights and the lefts, whatever it is, how do we what can we do to help extend a hand and show the kingdom of God that is here and now, and build those bridges with others during this time? What are your thoughts?
So the thought here is probably not a comforting one, but when Jesus says that, do not think that I've come to bring peace. I'm not coming to bring peace, but a sword. Father will be turned against son, mother, all this division. I think that this is largely what he's talking about. Because at the end of the day, you will have to choose. You will have to make a decision. And a lot of times, the church that we recognize and are familiar with here in the United States likes to hedge a little bit, right? You go into church and it's fine to have an American flag and then to also preach about this kingdom, even though those two things are fundamentally at odds. And so, just as Jesus says that no one can serve 2 masters, you will love one and hate the other, we will have to decide, like, is what we have right now something that we are willing to work for and improve upon, or are we willing to leave it at an altar to whatever God it belongs to and pursue that which God has, right? Are we willing to be that man who finds a treasure in the field, goes and sells all of his belongings so that he can invest everything in this treasure? Or are we willing to do that, right? And that is in large part like the thesis of my book. Are we willing to engage this imagination? Because at the end of the day, no, I don't have answers. I don't know what the perfect thing looks like. I just do know, based upon everything on the testimony of Jesus, that it's not this. And so when we talk about like the dualisms and the right and the wrong and everything, there are a lot of people who say like, oh, I'm politically homeless. And they mean that they find themselves somewhere between conservatives and the liberals or progressives or whatever have you. And I'll often say that I'm politically homeless as well, but I don't mean that I'm in the middle of a spectrum trying to find my place. I mean that this spectrum in and of itself doesn't have a place for me. Like I can't be charted on that because like they're both arguing about the same things. Progressives and conservatives in our political reality are both accepting scarcity as a given. And so when you realize that, no, actually, I reject all of this wholeheartedly. I think that there's enough for all of us. We just have to be real about it. What that means then is then you are at odds with most of the popular discourse on a whole lot of things. And you have to be okay with that. You have to be okay with people suggesting that you are not being realistic or pragmatic, because they are telling the truth. You are not being realistic or pragmatic. There's nothing realistic about a kingdom that is yet coming. It'll be real when it gets here, right? There's nothing like pragmatism is going to kill the imagination in that way, because it's hard to bring about a wholly other thing when all of the tools we have here have been set in stone for at least a couple hundred years, right? Like we're a constitutional democracy, all that stuff is set in stone. Yeah, being pragmatic about it won't bring about this other thing. It's not designed for that other thing. And so are you willing to almost like self-marginalize? Are you willing to take yourself out of the mainstream discourse to pursue this other thing? And that's a very hard decision to make. I'll be all the way honest about that, even for myself. Like when it comes to, if you take the ballot box, oh, do I vote for any of these people? Do I throw my vote away to a third party? Now, this is not me emphasizing, because I've voted for people in major parties or whatever. I've been pragmatic. But when it comes to how we're thinking through these things and talking about them, we have to realize that the pragmatic and like the dualistic thinking is actually counterproductive to what it is that we claim we're trying to do here. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Well, no, I don't think it answers it. I think it addresses it, speaks to it.
Yeah, because there's not a clear answer. Like we do have to make our own way, and a lot of times we have to distance ourselves from, sometimes we don't know yet what we're moving toward, but we know what we're moving away from.
Right.
And yeah. Oh, go ahead. Do you have a thought?
Yeah.
Oh, I saw you inhale and I was waiting for the exhale.
Yeah, because when we think about following Jesus, the command is always follow me. It's never really clear about where we're going. This is the kingdom, right? And we know that, okay, we're going to have to leave some things behind, but it's not until Jesus starts heading toward the cross where he starts making things clear about where we're going. So Jesus says, follow me. And everybody's like, cool. And then when he says, hey, guys, I need to let you guys know that they about to kill me. I'm gonna come back, but they about to kill me. And Peter's like, bro, no, we're not letting that happen. And Jesus says, get thee behind me, Satan. Like, this is what I have to do. And so what it means to follow Jesus is to live in such a way that whoever is in charge will want you gone. We got to accept that as a reality. That is part of what it means. The good news is that having been committed to the way of Jesus, even if it means persecution, even if it means being tortured and executed publicly, even if it means that, the good news is that the love and the power of God cannot be defeated by that action, that God has the final say on what is,
Yeah, that's good. Kind of leads toward deconstruction, Marcia.
Yeah, I know. Speaking of where we're going, I know there's a lot of people. I mean, I think you even mentioned it's probably in the intro or somewhere I read in your book where it was talking about that the church, people are leaving the church in droves, and the nuns are the most people, seems to be the fastest growing category of people that are saying, maybe they're agnostic or atheist or just don't know what they believe anymore. And they're leaving a lot of the religious constructs that they had, and they're going into this term of deconstruction. And so there's a quote here from your chapter on this. People often ask me if there's any advice I would give someone going through the process of reevaluating. I like that, reevaluating, deconstructing, or even decolonizing their faith. One refrain I keep coming back to is that you cannot do any of that in any worthwhile way until you get comfortable with being called a heretic. I laughed at that. We will not be able to wrestle with this faith unless we run the risk of having our walk altered in the aftermath. The people who stand to benefit from your conformity will never encourage you to interrogate your constraints. I'm not suggesting that there is nothing worthwhile in the faith you and I may have inherited. I'm affirming that there is more to God than what you've inherited, which goes back to my earlier thing about thinking bigger. So yeah, I think, and I have a follow-up question to that, but first of all, can you tell us more about how you began to see the constraints in your own faith?
Most definitely. It started happening when I would speak things that I knew to be true based on the faith that I inherited to people who did not have that same faith. And when they would share of their experience, I had a couple of options. I could invalidate their experience and say that it does not line up with mine and what I've inherited, and therefore it is not true. Or I could think of, wait, am I missing something in this expression? Is this fully formed, or is there more to what I know? And because the path that I chose was to trust people to be reliable narrators of their own experience, I began to ask questions of God, right? And though Jesus says that I am the way, the truth, and the life, no one comes to the Father except through me, Jesus also says that other sheep have I who are not of this fold. And when we take those words seriously, what that means is that there are people who are experiencing things that it doesn't mean that they are necessarily outside the will of God, but it is fundamentally different than the way that you have connected with the world and the divine around you. So for me, like, the starting point was just sitting with people, not necessarily with the commitment to convert them to my way of thinking and showing up in the world at the forefront of my mind, but sitting with them as people who also bear the image of God. What can you teach me about God? Like, or do I think that I have all the knowledge because I said the sinner's prayer one time? Do I think that I have all the knowledge because I was the Bible quiz champion when I was 9 years old? Right. And so a lot of times it's a matter of humbling yourself, because Jesus dined with a whole lot of people. And it's interesting that trying to make sure that they were thinking the right way wasn't always the topic of conversation. Sometimes it's fellowship for fellowship's sake. And in that, we become more aware of the fullness of God's creation. I take it seriously when God says that he created the world and then called it good. I take those words seriously. And so I try to interrogate and investigate the fullness of that good creation and let that color my faith as much as what I've inherited.
Mm. You know, there was another quote. I'm going to see if I can find here. It was in that same. Oh, yeah, here it is. A deconstruction journey that does not account for the power of the story is a journey that will lead you from harmful arrogance to harmful arrogance. And I love that you tackle that a little bit in the deconstruction thing about making sure we don't mirror what we're walking away from, but just on the other side. Can you talk about that for a minute? Because that's a very
Yeah.
real thing I'm seeing too. I think I went through that myself. I was like, oh, okay, I got this figured out now.
Right. And it's funny because the I think one of the stories within that chapter is a real life interaction I had with the perfect internet stranger, which is
Yeah.
my life here. But it was somebody who had moved from one extreme to another. They were in a very fundamentalist uh, expression of Christianity. They were open about their past. They have a degree from a Bible college, and part of their frustration was they couldn't even transfer those credits anywhere because it wasn't accredited by anybody except one of them bodies that accredits unserious institutions, right? And so one of the things that I realized in dealing with him, I was like, oh, you still act like you did back then. It's just that you don't believe in God, or you claim you're not believing in God. And the reason I say that is because back then, if you would have met me, you would have told me that my expression and my belief in God was the wrong one. I needed to come to your side. And right now that you left those behind, you're telling me that me believing in God at all is wrong, and I need to come to your side. You have the same exact ethic about you, which is just that the target has changed. And what we need to understand here is that your beliefs weren't even the main problem here. It was the degree to which your beliefs led you to show up the way that you were showing up in the world. And now that you left those beliefs behind, you're still showing up the same exact way. To put it another way, if I were one of my enslaved ancestors, I would not too much care whether or not the person restraining my freedom believed in God or not. My freedom is the main thing at stake here, right? And so, like, when it comes to being a better human or whatever, we need to look at not just your beliefs, but your witness, how you're showing up in the world, how you're treating people. And sometimes the things that we get the most frustrated about within some of these high control environments, we take all of those out of the door with us. We just leave the creeds behind. And I think that there's a missed opportunity at self-awareness. We talked about emotional intelligence earlier and self-reflection. There's a missed opportunity there when, okay, now we're affirming different things, but we're still showing up the same ways.
Yeah. It's like, I think it might have been in Brian McLaren's book, Faith After Doubt, where he talked about that fundamentalism can show up in atheism. It can show up in your deconstruction journey. You know, if you're deep into that fundamentalist, rule-minded, right, wrong, black, white, non-dualistic thinking, yeah, it can show up in any of these areas, right?
Right. And that's like, at the end of the day, I don't think you have to be a Christian or believe in Jesus to recognize the wisdom and the golden rule. Do unto others as you would. If you was a jerk for Jesus and you still a jerk for whatever it is you believe afterwards,
Jerk.
like, what are we doing here?
You're just a jerk.
yeah. At the end of the day, like, you don't have to be that way. You don't.
Right.
We can recognize the ways that we are being perceived and received. We can sit with that, and we can choose to show up differently.
Yeah, that's great.
One of the deconstruction stories in scripture that I love to read is Paul's, because I see it as, he had all the knowledge and all the facts and thought he was doing the right thing for God. And then when the Holy Spirit met him there, He was overwhelmed by what he didn't know and what he had never
Right.
seen before. And then the scales started slowly falling from his eyes as he tried to make sense of what was happening around him and who he was in the midst of it. And he had to get help. He had to get help from Ananias to be able to see in a new way. So how do we
I've
do
never
that?
heard Paul. I've never heard Paul presented as somebody going through the process of deconstruction in that way before. That was really beautiful, by the way. I'm
Oh.
sorry. I stepped on the question you just asked, but I was floored by that. So thank you.
Yeah. So that it's a very personal process, and it happens at a time and a place when we start to see differently. And it's not, I don't think we can, although it feels isolating and overwhelming and dark,
Right.
there are people that help us see again and
Yes.
see in new ways. And
Yes.
so how do we do that? How do we, when we don't feel like we belong in a church building, and we know that our faith has to, take action. We've got to move in our faith and not just sit in a building. Like, these things kind of start coming together for us. What do we do? What do we do that? How do we do that?
Yeah. So because of the faith that a lot of us have inherited, we often and understandably put a lot of emphasis on the church building as the locus of the bride of Christ. It hasn't always historically been the case. Well, it has for most of history. Let me be clear about that. But in the Bible, we don't see a lot of church buildings, right? Like, it's the Lord's Supper. Like, we're meeting in houses, we're breaking bread. And so my strongest encouragement in that regard, in terms of how to do that, would be to remember the importance of fellowship, even if it's not a formalized sing some songs, pass the peace, collect the offering, hear a word, get a benediction, and leave out. What does community look like in this season? Can we share meals? Can we share our needs? Can we share our tragedies and triumphs? Will we feel seen and heard? When Paul talks about not taking of the Lord's Supper or taking of communion unworthily, what happens there is that there were people who were getting a little greedy and grubbing, eating all the food before everybody had a chance to get there. A lot of commentators suggested it was the day laborers who were getting there late because they had to work, while the other people were over there getting grub. He said, "Yo, you couldn't eat at home." And the problem there is that that community was not structured around belonging. Some people felt devalued. What would community look like for you in this season that made everybody know that they had a place in the kingdom and in this community, right? And so even if that's let's meet at a bowling alley, and we gonna have us a bowling team, and once a month before then we're gonna go and have a potluck, or we're gonna grab us something to eat, we're gonna go to Chili's or whatever, and we're gonna do community together because Jesus loves us. But then there's also this matter of rehearsing why it is that we're doing this. And it's because we believe that we are the hands and feet of the risen Jesus, right? So if and that's if your deconstruction journey is leading you to still, some people's deconstruction leads them away from Jesus. I don't have that much advice in that regard because of where I am. I don't want to lead people where I haven't gone,
Right.
But if it's a matter of, no, I'm not ready to be done with God yet, but I don't know about that building. What is it that you feel that you were missing in that building? And can you cultivate it here? Do you believe that the Spirit of God lives in you to the extent that you can make something shake even apart from that building?
Yeah, that's perfect. Love it.
That's awesome.
I'm going to have to listen to this podcast myself like 5 times.
Oh, Lord.
Love it.
So we are getting close to running out of time, but I can't end without talking just a little bit, because I know that you are passionate about social justice. And there is a quote in, I believe it's chapter 6, Straight Jacket Faith, which I love that, where you talk about, I'm going to just read this quote here. The gospel got to be good news. More specifically, it has to be good news to people who have been through some things. The message of Jesus brings joy to the poor, the captive, the blind, and the oppressed. And that is not an idea generated by liberation theology. You mentioned liberation theology, which a minute ago, which I hear a lot about. That is Jesus's own words. But it seems like today, like you say, if you emphasize the same social aspects that Jesus said would define his ministry and his followers, you're going to get tagged as a liberal, or that's liberation theology, or you've gone woke. And then the one thing I really highlight is the social gospel is a false gospel. I hear that all the time. Can you just speak to that for just a minute?
Yeah, I don't have that much to say about it. I don't think it's a very serious statement at all. You
You
know,
don't?
in terms of the social gospel being a false gospel, like, because one of the things I recognize that a lot of these things are crafted in political realities, right?
Yeah,
So a
right.
lot of what we recognize as the modern evangelical movement is a direct response to the social gospel. Like, oh, you guys are emphasizing this too much at the expense of the Bible. And that is
Mhm.
something that people are going to be debating from now until Jesus comes back. At the end of the day, if you think I'm emphasizing this at the expense of that, you get to emphasize what you want, but you can't call this false because it's in there. It
Yeah.
doesn't make sense. It
Yeah.
doesn't make sense to call this false. You can call it incomplete. Fine, cool. I'm good with that. And you, but when we call it false, what we're doing is we're in essence calling Jesus, or at least part of Jesus, a liar.
Mhm.
Because Jesus says that this is what Jesus says, that we will be judged by the extent that we have treated the least of these, right? When we feed the hungry, clothe the poor, and visit the sick, that those are the things, right? It's not even a matter. Very rarely does Jesus emphasize any aspect of orthodoxy as being the metric by which what we're judged. Now, I'm
Mhm.
not here to say that's not important, but I'm saying one of the things we have to recognize is that when things are labeled as like false gospels in that way, in terms of being, particularly when it comes to social issues, the only outcome there is reinforcing a constraint on another side.
Mhm.
Now, they'll call that biblical fidelity. They'll call it orthodoxy. They'll call it something, but
Mhm.
really all it is about, to the name of that chapter, is getting you back in that straitjacket. It's
Mhm.
about like, no, you're getting out of line. We have to call you back in. And if it is for freedom that we have been set free, then we have to reject that mentality.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, when people ask me like, oh, how do you answer people who say these things about you, the answer is pretty simple. I don't answer them. You get to
Mm.
say what you want. That's fine.
Mhm.
you know.
Well, the thing about the social gospel, or that a lot of people try to reject, in a lot of religious situations. I mean, I see churches going, "Oh, we're doing that. We are clothing the poor. We have a clothing ministry, or we
Yeah.
have, we feed the poor. We go down and we serve at the mission, or we do all these things." But they're not doing anything to change
Right.
the situation. So
Right.
it feels like what they're doing is they're doing just enough to make themselves feel like they're following what Jesus tells us to do, but they're not willing to get down and do the hard work of actually changing the system, and so that these people aren't there. And so, that's one of the frustration things for me personally, is
Yeah.
trying to talk to people about that and say, "Look, that's not enough." And then I don't know if I'm making sense,
No,
but
I hear you wholeheartedly. I think that's describing some of that hedging that I was talking about earlier, when people try to have things both ways.
yeah.
So I'm like, when we address those needs, what we're really doing is not only participating in, but affirming the reality of the system. We're
Mhm.
affirming the reality of scarcity.
Yeah.
One of the frustrations that you're expressing right now is the reality that we're not actually pursuing this kingdom, because in the kingdom that is to come, we do not have all of these needs that are going unmet that need to be met in this way. So
Mm.
yes, it's good that we do these things, but that can't be where we end. And some people take that one verse, oh, the poor you will always have among you, as license to be like, oh, well, Jesus said it. I'm like, no, that's Jesus describing the current reality.
Mm.
It's not Jesus affirming that when we get to the eternal kingdom, when we get to heaven, that it's still going to be beggars on the side of the streets of gold. That's
Mm.
not how that works.
Yeah.
And so a lot of it, to the point of this book and everything, is about, are you really engaging your imagination to the point where Jesus says that you should pray on earth as it is in heaven? If Jesus had a political slogan, that would probably be what it was: on earth as it is in heaven. Whatever it is that we believe about the coming kingdom, we ought to be praying and then working toward that end right here and now.
Yeah.
Mhm.
It's
If
beautiful.
Jesus had a political slogan, I love that.
So I quote that in the book, and I actually got that from Pastor Rich Johnson. I like attributing people for
Oh, there
their
you go.
words.
There you
Yeah,
go.
there we
There
go.
you go.
And
Yeah.
I got the words tattooed on my arm because I thought it was such a dope tweet right there. On
It
earth, as it is in
is.
heaven.
That's
Yes,
awesome.
yes.
So you've got a big week coming up.
I do. I do.
Yeah.
Most definitely.
Yeah.
We are-
Tell us about it. Tell us how people can find you and what you have coming up on Tuesday.
Yeah, the best place to find me is at pastortrey05.com. That is pastortrey05.com. From there, you can find all of my socials, including I'm on X under at pastortrey05.com. I feel so gross saying that. It's always going to be Twitter. Okay.
I know, me too.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at PastorTrey05, on Instagram at PastorTrey05, Facebook. It's, I think, real Pastor Trey05 because something weird happened there. I had to switch it up. But all of that is linked at my website. I also regularly write in a newsletter called the Sunday Move. You can find that at pastortrey05.com. Oh no, pastortrey05.substack.com. But again, all of that is linked at my website. And with regards to what's coming up on Tuesday, at the time of this recording, we are 6 days away from Theologizin Bigger being available everywhere. I'm so excited to get this out and I'll share it with everybody.
Yay. Well, this is going to be airing on Monday, the day before. So,
yes,
y'all, the book is Theologizin Bigger. Go pre-order it now, or order it. It's an amazing book. I was raving about it to my husband, and we will be praying for you, Pastor Trey. We wish you so much luck, and we thank you so much for your time today.
I really appreciate you guys having me. This has been wonderful.
Oh, good. Good.
Thank you.
See you out on socials in the meantime.
Yep.
Yes, ma'am.
Kicking butt out there. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.